Hello, this is Mr. Gillespie. Thank you for watching my PowerPoint presentation on the growth of Chicago and cities in the United States. This is meant to be an introduction to urbanization in the U.S. and should build off of what you already have read in your textbooks. The presentation will set the stage for your in-class activity. As you know, cities have developed throughout the United States. You go to school in the third most populous city in the country. And here's a picture of the L Junction at Lake and Wells from the 1920s. Here's a picture of Times Square in New York, showing that cities are centers of entertainment as well. Yet cities are beneficial for other reasons too. They are centers of commerce and employment. And here's a photograph of South Water Street from 1915. You'll notice all the trucks and goods and people milling about on this street, which is now actually beneath the level of the current street grid. Cities are centers of recreation too. Here's a picture of Lake Michigan from 1925. But cities pose their own problems. They may be crowded or dirty, and they may be more susceptible to outbreaks of disease. And here's an image of my hometown of St. Louis from 1875, and you'll notice that there's a lot of steamboats and smoke rising from those boats along the riverfront. So cities could be polluted places. But today, as we did back then, cities are portrayed as places where people can live, work, and play together in a clean environment. And cities are growing more attractive. As you'll notice here, in 1790, there were only 24 cities or towns that had 2,500 people or more. But 200 years later, in 1990, there were almost 8,500 towns that met this criteria. The population that was urban in 1790 was below 10%, and yet in 2010, it was above 80%. So the question is, why are cities becoming more popular? The center of population in the U.S. Has moved westward and southward over time. You'll notice that in 1790, it was actually east of the capital of Washington, D.C. But every 10 years, it has moved progressively west and south as people have moved to the Midwest, California, Texas, Arizona, and other states. But why did cities develop? You've read about some potential explanations in your textbook, and these include geography, industry, and immigration. Let's start with geography. This helps explain where cities developed. Early on, cities like St. Louis developed near major rivers and waterways. You'll see here a picture of the Mississippi River watershed, which was where most cities in the Midwest tended to be founded. They were usually founded along the Ohio River, the Missouri, the Mississippi River, or in the case of St. Louis, at the junction of two major rivers, the Missouri and Mississippi. Industry helps explain why cities developed. Advancements in agricultural technology left many rural residents out of work, while new manufacturing jobs appeared in cities. Electricity and mass transit changed how people and goods traveled and helped them live and work in separate places, leading to concentrations of large businesses in these downtown regions, like the stockyards here in Chicago. Finally, immigration helps explain who drove the development of cities. In Chicago, about half of the population in 1870, 48%, was born in another country. This was true of many other big cities throughout the United States, as cities provided the structure and the services that made them strong ports of entry for immigrants. So let's talk about Chicago and look a little deeper here. In 1833, it received its first town charter, and 4 years later, on March 4th, it was incorporated as a city in 1837. William Ogden, who you may recognize from one of the streets around here, was elected as the first mayor. And it grew from this to this. to this. You'll notice here the steamboats, the railroads, the roads, the use of the river. The city was a bustling place, and this is right before the Great Fire. The city's population was booming. In 1840, it had 4,500 people. In 1850, just 10 years later, the population had increased all the way up to 30,000. And it continued to grow until in 1870 there were 300,000 people within the city limits. This is a huge increase from the city's founding when it had just a few hundred people. And at the time, it was one of the fastest growing cities in the world. But then this happened. The Great Chicago Fire destroyed 3.5 square miles of the city. At least 18,000 buildings were destroyed, about 300 people were killed, and over a third of the population was left homeless. Here's a map showing the extent of the fire within the city. All the areas within red were touched by the fire, and most buildings within this area were destroyed, with the exception of the water tower and a few other structures throughout the city. And yet, the city's population continued to grow. In 1880, there were 500,000 people. This is 9 years after the fire. This is also 200,000 more people than there were in 1870, just a year before the fire. The population doubled again in 1890, and there were over 1 million people. And it continued to grow all the way up until 1950, when there were 3.5 million people in the city limits. So we have a couple questions to consider. And the first of these is, why did Chicago grow so rapidly in the first place? Secondly, why did Chicago continue to grow following the fire of 1871? The answers to these questions will help to explain urbanization on a large scale in the United States, but also the history of Chicago on a local scale. We'll explore some of these answers in our next class. Thank you for watching.